We are on to lecture 3 of the week 3, uh, still in environmental ethics, but now we've moved on to the question of geoengineering. Uh, it's an interesting thing. There are some technologies that, in theory at least, could help us solve some of these climate change problems, um, but they're risky. Stephen Gardiner here is going to argue that some of the arguments in favor of using geoengineering or even researching geoengineering are bad, right? And in the end, he seems to uh, cast doubt on whether we should even pursue research on these things, much less sort of deploy them. Okay, so what is geoengineering? Well, there's not like a single definition that really captures it all, right? I think the best we can do is to say geoengineering involves the intentional manipulation of the environment on a global scale, but there's so many different types that have been proposed that it's pretty hard to treat them all as a single thing in purposes of an ethical argument. They range from putting big mirrors in the sky to deflect the sun's radiation out, hopefully cool the earth that way, fertilizing the ocean to increase plant life, which would then suck up carbon dioxide, or massive reforestation for the same purpose. You can capture and bury greenhouse gases underground. Um, there's lots of different ones. So for the purposes of this argument, he's going to have to focus on one, and he's decided to focus on one that's kind of popular, at least in discussions, because it's seems relatively easy and cheap, right? So we know that volcanoes, when they erupt, uh, they shoot sort of particles into the atmosphere, and they actually do have the effect of cooling the environment. It's been documented. Large volcanic eruptions have reduced the Earth's temperature. So you might think, well, can we mimic that artificially? And at least in theory, we can, right? We can shoot sulfide particles into the atmosphere that will increase the reflectivity of the atmosphere, bounce more sunlight off, and cool down the Earth. So people who favor geoengineering favor it for differing reasons, depending on who you ask. So some people like it because it's more cost effective than cutting emissions, right? That seems sort of the cause of global warming in the first place is the emission of all these greenhouse gases. So the most obvious thing to do would be to stop, emitting them. Problem is that's very sort of costly and requires a lot of administration, right? It means sort of outlawing fossil fuels, which is difficult to do given the political situation. Also, at this point, there's so many gases in the air that even if we stopped all emissions, we would still have global warming. Um, Other people think, well, at the very least, even if it can't reverse global warming, it can buy us some time. It can slow down the heating up of the Earth. That will give us time to muster the political will, right, to turn around and use alternative fuels. Uh, Other people really think it's at most a last resort if the alternative is total catastrophe. Right? Um, so what your goal is, right? What you're thinking the benefit could be is going to sort of differ, um, and it's going to affect what you think should be done and when and how, right? So again, it's a pretty diverse sort of area. It's hard to treat it all uh, as similar for the purposes of an argument. So again, Gardner is going to be talking about one particular type of argument for for the purposes of this essay, um, injecting sulfide aerosols. Okay, so this argument is a form of sort of a lesser evil argument. Hopefully, this is familiar, right? It comes up often in politics, right? When you're voting, you might say something like, "I don't like either of these candidates, but I'm going to vote for the lesser evil, right? The less bad candidate, something like that." So that's sort of the idea of this argument for geoengineering, is that either way, it's bad, but one option is less bad, and the less bad option is geoengineering. So the nice thing about this argument is it does concede that reducing emissions would be the better option, right? but it also concedes that we're not getting very far with that. The progress thus far does not look like it's on track to uh, sort of stave off the worst consequences of climate change. So, right, the argument, the rationale goes, if we're faced with these terrible consequences of climate change, which we've discussed in the previous lectures, I won't go through them again. That's bad, right? Maybe geoengineering is bad too, but if it's less bad and we only have those two options, then it seems like we should go with geoengineering. So that is, we'll get into that argument in more detail, right? But that's the overview of it. He's going to call that the arm the future argument, right? So we need to start now, uh, getting ready so that we even have that option, that geoengineering option, because we need to do more research. So we need to arm the future so that we have a lesser evil option when the time comes and we may need to use it. Now, Gardiner is ultimately going to argue against this arming the future argument. He concedes that it's a fairly strong argument, right? He's trying to give um, the proponent of geoengineering their best shot at giving a good argument, right? And in general, I think as I've stressed multiple times, that's a great strategy for writing a paper. It makes, if you can present a really strong argument and then knock it down, that makes you look great, right? So that's what he's going to do. And he's going to argue for three conclusions. First of all, he's going to consider the arming the future argument in detail and say that it's not conclusive, it's not convincing, right? Two, this lesser evil type argument, he says the arming the future, the way they use lesser evils, it really obscures what evil means, right? And it's sort of manipulating what we take evil to mean in the context of geoengineering. Again, we'll describe that in more detail later. And then three, in general, he's going to say we should always be suspicious of arguments like this that sort of justify or let us off the hook on our own bad behavior, right? So by our, I mean, relatively wealthy countries that produce a lot of emissions, right? Uh, if if somebody produces an argument that says, you know what, you don't need to really change your lifestyle, just shoot a bunch of stuff in the air, and that'll be the lesser evil, and that'll be fine, and you're off the hook. That you ought to be suspicious. I mean, of course, again, you have to get into the details and see what's wrong with the argument, see what's fallacious, but that might sort of be a trigger to you to be like, this seems awfully convenient, right? Is there a fallacy somewhere in the argument? All right, so once again, setting up the problem, should be familiar with this at this point, but the existence and danger of climate change has been well known since at least 1990, when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released their report. In the decade after the 1990, global emissions continue to go up, right, at a rate of 30%, and they're just going up faster and faster, as we see in this chart. We are currently, so in 1990, that report said, well, there's kind of the worst case scenario, best case scenario, depending on what happens in the future with emissions, if people pay attention to this report. We are definitely in the worst case scenario. We did not really pay enough attention to that report or change our behavior. So we've had a few decades to get our act together, and we do not seem to be doing it. It's perhaps not surprising, right? This inertia, this like inability to really get moving on fixing climate change, Gardiner thinks can be explained by three factors. They are global factors, intergenerational factors, and the theoretical dimensions of the problem. So the global dimension is this. The effects of climate change are distributed globally, and we don't really have any governmental institutions that govern the whole globe. We have the UN, but it's not particularly powerful, right? It doesn't have, we have the EU, but we don't have sort of a worldwide COP that says they can tell all the countries, hey, you need to reduce emissions by 40% or we're going to impose these penalties. It's like nothing, we don't have anything that does that. And even worse, right, that there's this disparity where the rich countries make the most emissions, but then the poor countries often are going to be the ones that suffer the worst because they just don't have the resources to, again, move their populations away from areas where sea levels are threatening their homes and so on. So since there's no central global control, And because there's this kind of incentive for the rich countries to go ahead and create emissions because they're not going to get hit as hard as the poorer countries, there's just the incentive structure is set up so that like this is going to perpetuate. Right? Another problem is the intergenerational dimension of the problem. So the effects of our current emissions are not going to be felt for some time, for some decades. Um, the greenhouse gases we produce will hang around in the atmosphere for any up to thousands of years. So many of the harms that we're now causing won't be felt as acutely by us, they will be felt by future generations. And just as a species, we don't have a lot of practice governing our own moral behavior with respect to people that aren't even born yet. And there are even complicated metaphysical issues with this stuff that we talked about in week one. We just really don't really have the practice and the conceptual framework to talk about the ethics of our own actions and the effect on people that don't exist. Which brings us to the theoretical dimension. That's not the only tricky theoretical issue. There's a lot going on in this. First of all, it requires a lot of science, right, to determine. It had been sort of up until now. In fact, recently a study came out that sort of was the first one to definitively say absolutely climate change is happening and it's absolutely the fault of humans, right? Before they would sort of hedge and say it's highly probable, right, and so on. Um, that's because science of this is it's a large scale issue, and we had to develop a lot of techniques and get a lot of data before we could say with the sort of confidence that scientists like to have that absolutely this is right the fault of humans creating emissions of greenhouse gases. Um, Harms like other generations, non-human animals, what is our duty to nature, uh, harms of one country to another. These are all sort of much stickier ethical questions than like, is it okay to slap someone in the face randomly, right? We have a lot of more practice with sort of person to person moral considerations and much less in these large scale things. So this lack of clarity then is going to make it tempting to even maybe subconsciously craft an argument that says that lets me off scot free. Right? Okay, so in this lesser evil argument, Gardiner he refers to geoengineering as what the core solution, right, in the context of this lesser evil argument. So if you see that term come up, the core solution, that just means geoengineering. And he worries that the core solution is not actually a solution, right? It's actually part of the problem. It's actually making it worse. And this is in some way conceded by the arming the future argument. They do say it's an evil, right? It's just a lesser one than climate change. Um, so first, right, just to set the stage, what's even evil about geoengineering? Why even concede that it's an evil, right? Because if you think about it, here's one argument for engineering: cost effectiveness, right? It's much cheaper to inject sulfates into the atmosphere than to transition the entire world economy to wind and solar and off of fossil fuels, right? And administratively, it's fairly simple, right? You don't need a sort of a world governing organization that doesn't even really exist yet to be created and then impose laws and regulations, right, on countries for producing uh, greenhouse gases. Instead, just anyone who has the technology can just shoot the stuff in the air, right? Um, Maybe, arguably, the U.S. could do it without asking anybody. There's not really any laws about this sort of thing. Maybe even just a rogue agent. Maybe, right, Elon Musk could do it on his own. But of course, you you may have already guessed that there are problems with that argument. So yeah, maybe it's cost effective, um, but number one, this injection of sulfate aerosols into the air that might cool the temperature of the globe a bit by deflecting sunlight, but it's not going to get rid of the greenhouse gases, and it's not going to stop all the problems they cause. Like to take one example, ocean acidification. Right. So really, um, it might slow down one aspect of this whole thing, but it's not going to address the whole problem. Um, And it is cheap, relatively, to shoot this stuff into the air. But that, of course, doesn't consider potential side effects, right? We don't even know what all those might be and how much those might cost. So to say it's cost effective is really only thinking about costs in a very narrow sense. We really need more research on that. Um, and three, if in principle, yeah, it's administratively simple, right? You just get one country who decides, yeah, it's okay, we're going to shoot this off. But in reality, like other countries are probably not going to be okay with let's say the United States just doing this unilaterally. Um, you could like start a world war, right? If you start doing this without asking other countries. Um, and number four, Gardner thinks just the whole principle of the thing is weird, right? That the lesson he thinks you, or at least arguably you would want to draw from the problem of climate change is that we are not being good stewards of nature and of the earth, and that we need to change our behavior and stop exploiting it and trying to dominate it technologically, right? And geoengineering is just keeping barreling down that path of dominate nature, right? We mess nature up. All right, well, we'll use technology to do something else to allow us to keep sort of messing nature up. Um, so the upshot of these objections is like, yeah, maybe in one narrow sense, it's cheaper, right? Geoengineering, but there are a lot of downsides, and um, those might justify calling it an evil, even if it is a lesser one. Now, another argument is, look, this lesser evil argument, right? It's not even saying we have to deploy the geoengineering stuff now. It's just saying we need to research it so that in the future, right, when it comes to a crunch time, we have these two evils staring us in the face. We'll have the lesser evil choice, right? If we don't do the research, we just have the one evil and no choice. But there are objections with that aspect of the argument too, right? So first of all, doing research costs money, right? It is, you could choose to spend that money on other things. It's going to take money away from other projects, and it's not enough to just increase our knowledge. It needs to have benefits. So you can't just argue that spending money on this research is good just so we can know stuff. Like you have to argue that doing this research will actually benefit us. Uh, and some knowledge, not all knowledge is good necessarily, right? Some knowledge is not worth being pursued either because it's trivial, right? Um, so I'm not going to get a research grant to count the hairs on my head, right? That would add to our knowledge of the world, but it's pointless, right? It's useless. Uh, and you might argue that geoengineering is so unlikely to actually make a difference or be successful that it's ultimately trivial. It's not too much different from counting the hairs on my head. People have said that. Um, or you could make the even stronger claim, number three, that some kinds of research are actually morally bad, right? There is sort of forbidden knowledge. Um, this should be fairly obvious, actually, right? I could do research on the most painful way, right, to kill somebody. No one will ever give me a grant on that. It's completely unethical. And why would you want to know that? You shouldn't know that, right? Um, so when we do research, it's not just all knowledge is fine and it's harmless, right? We do care about the aim of the research, the probability of it providing some benefit, and whether it's the kind of thing we want to encourage. So it's not harmless to say, oh, yeah, let's just do the research and then we'll have options later. And finally, it's not even clear that you can really separate just doing the research with actual deployment of the technology, right? So there is such a thing as what we call institutional inertia, which is somewhat similar to the sunk cost fallacy. I don't know if you know the sunk cost fallacy is, but like um, the example is, say you bought a concert ticket, for like a month from now, and the date of the concert comes, and you don't really feel that good, and it's very hot. Say it's an outdoor festival, and you're like, oh, I don't really want to go to this thing. I think I'll have a miserable time, but I spent the money, so I have to go. Well, no, that's a fallacy, right? Um, if you go, you've spent the money and had a terrible time, right? So why not just cut your losses at some point? But this is a well-known bias in psychology of people and then also of human institutions, right? So once we start spending money on this quote unquote solution to climate change, people are going to get excited about it and they're going to start to assume that we should then deploy it, regardless of what the research ends up saying. So you have to be very careful, even at the research stage, to not sort of play into people's cognitive biases and sort of make it a fait accompli that you will, in fact, end up using the technology. And once the knowledge exists out there, even if sort of maybe the United States decides not to use it or whatever, once it's out there, right, some rogue company or person might take it and decide to deploy it anyways. That could be a problem. And there are serious issues about whether it's even ethical to do the research, given that so many people have an interest in the climate. Basically, every being on the planet has some vested interest in the state of the climate. And so typically when you do research, you want to make sure that people who have some sort of interest in it are on board with it, approve of it, right? And it's not clear that you could do that on a worldwide basis. The next article will talk more about that. How could you do that ethically when everyone seems to have an interest in it? So seems like there are potential evils even associated with the research itself, let alone the deployment. Okay, with that background, all right, what makes it a lesser evil? What makes it an evil at all, right? And how could it be lesser or greater evil? Now we'll consider the arming the future argument in some detail. So it consists of 8 premises and a conclusion. Premise 1, reducing global emissions is by far the best way to address climate change. That, at least for the purposes of this article, seems clear. We're assuming it. Premise 2, in the last 15 years or so, there's been little progress on reducing emissions. That seems to be true. Premise 3, there is little reason to think that this will change in the near future. That seems to be true given our history, right? We had some time to work on it. Not much happened. Not much has changed, right, in their political institutions since then. So there's not much reason to believe that we're all of a sudden going to get much more active in reducing emissions. Premise 4, if very substantial progress on emissions reduction is not made soon, then at some point, probably 50 or so years into the future, we may end up facing a choice between allowing catastrophic impacts to occur or engaging in geoengineering. So these are the 2 choices that it sets up. Now this premise, you may want to question, right? Are there really only these 2 options? Right? Premise 5, these are both bad options. Right? So that's been argued. Seems good enough. Premise 6, but geoengineering is less bad, right? So this is the lesser evil part of the argument. I think we may question that premise as well. So therefore, now this is supposed to follow from the previous premises. If we're forced to choose, we should choose engineering, right? So if it's true that we only have 2 choices, and if it's true that one is less evil than the other, then it would follow that we should choose the less evil. Premise 8, but if we don't start to do serious scientific research on geoengineering options soon, we won't be in a position to choose it later. So important premise, right? Therefore, that gets us to the conclusion we need to start doing the research. Okay, so now Gardiner is going to sort of break down this argument and tell us what he thinks of it. So he says what's good about the argument is it admits that there are important considerations against geoengineering research and deployment, right? And it does offer a strong reason to prefer it to the alternative of climate change. But what he thinks is suspect is the way it uses a moral emergency as a reason to exempt us from the normal moral constraints against doing a bad thing, right? So usually if you say, oh, this thing is evil, right, then you should also say, then don't do it, right? That would be the normal conclusion you would draw. So it's taking this sort of emergency situation and sort of giving you a pass to do an evil thing, right? So let's look at some of his challenges to the arming the future argument. Challenge 1. Before assuming that the lesser of 2 evils should be chosen, we need more information. How likely is this emergency situation, right? So are we really going to approach this? Are we going to have this emergency? Is it going to be the most relevant emergency situations? Maybe there's other emergencies that require attention. And is it true that the 2 evils are the only alternatives, right? And finally, is the lesser evil really lesser, all things considered? So I mean, these are all important considerations. I think maybe the first 2 we can sort of assume for the purpose of argument that yes, we are going to run into this emergency situation. It's going to be pretty relevant. It's going to be an important situation. It's hard to imagine, maybe the threat of nuclear war could be happening at the same time, but like for the purposes of like the ethics of climate change, I think we can grant the proponent of the AFA argument those first two things. But it is important to wonder whether it's really true that those two evils are the only alternatives, right? So I have this button, love it or leave it, right? That's a false dichotomy, right? There are other options, right? I can try to stay in the USA and try to change it, right, and make it better. So I would love it. And then you want to know they claim that the lesser evil is lesser, but is it really, right? That needs some to be examined as well. And Gardiner says there's not clear answers to all of these questions. And we also have to consider the fact that, as he argued, right, pursuing the geoengineering research may make it more likely that it will happen, or sorry, that the emergency situation will happen, is what I mean. So if we start doing this research, right, are people going to assume, oh, okay, climate change has happened, they're going to figure it out, we don't need to change our behavior right now, we'll just shoot aerosols in the atmosphere when the time comes. You don't want that to happen. You would prefer us to cut emissions, right? And so if doing the research makes us less likely to cut emissions, that's bad. Okay, so are there other options besides these two evils? Now it's important, right? The arming the future argument doesn't say we are now in the emergency situation. We will be eventually. And this is an important difference. So this is not, when you're in an emergency situation, you have, you get cut a little slack, right? If the kid is drowning, you drop everything and jump in and save the kid. And if you accidentally sort of like bump somebody else and hurt them on the way to save the kid, it's okay. But we're not in that situation yet, right? It is technically possible to stop, think analytically about the situation and about what we should do, right? So first of all, it is still technically possible to just marshal a huge amount of resources, really get our butts in gear, something like a wartime mobilization, what we did in World War II, the Manhattan Project, and really get a save our climate thing happening, right? That really makes a difference. And then B, instead of researching geoengineering, there's other alternatives. We could research more on alternative fuels, right? If we really got some sort of like amazing alternative fuel that was cheaper and better than gas, that would be great too. That would really help us move off the fossil fuels. Maybe combine that with some investment in relocation assistance for peoples that will be impacted by climate change. So there's a lot of sort of options for beginning research. There's more than one way to go with this sort of research. Challenge 3, the arming the future argument assumes that we're just helping the future generations have more knowledge and tools, right? Hey, we're just giving you information. The problem with that is like we're the ones creating the crisis, right? So what is our moral obligation in that case? Is it merely to give future generations that we're currently harming, just give them more information, right? Or are you supposed to actually sort of like make it right with the people that you've harmed? So maybe we should be starting a compensation fund, right? Or maybe we should be taking on more risky things for ourselves now that would then decrease the risks for future people, right? Maybe we should be ready to just take a hatchet to our economy, right? If it means that we can reduce fuels consumption. Right? So pretending that we've somehow solved the problem just by creating a less evil option for the future, again, that can help sort of ensure the emergency situation if that allows us to think, well, we've done our part, right? We gave them an option. That doesn't seem to be really the moral obligation that we've placed upon ourselves by creating, again, all these emissions. Okay, so those are some challenges to some of the premises in the arming the future argument. And if you write your paper on this, it's useful to like when they lay out the argument in that way, right? You could write a paper saying, I'm going to challenge this particular premise, right? Or I'm going to defend the arming the future argument against Gardiner's challenge to this particular premise, right? That's the sort of like narrow kind of focus that I'd love to see in a paper. And when they lay the arguments out like that and the objections to them, it sort of helps you in focusing your paper. So now Gardner wants to talk sort of more generally about the problem with these sorts of lesser evil arguments. He says, now they are compelling, right? Because we tend to think that if you're really deeply committed to morality and acting ethically, sometimes you got to break the rules, right? So we've discussed, I think, in the context of Kant, the idea that like if you're right if you're in World War II Germany and you're hiding some Jews from the Nazis to save their lives, and then a soldier comes to the door, says, "Are you hiding anyone in here?" Uh, you should make an exception to your policy of truth, right? And you lie to the soldier, right? I think everyone's intuition would agree with that. Yeah, sometimes you got to lie, right, for a greater good. If you are actually committed to ethics instead of just pure rule following, right? Um, so that's why these lesser evil arguments are appealing sometimes, but they're not always that clear cut. So here's some problems with lesser evil arguments in general. Number one, what he calls opacity, right? So when you do get yourself in a situation where you have to break the normal moral rules um, and do the right thing, right, instead of following the rules, the correct decision there is going to be really dependent on some very subtle contextual factors. We don't have any rules to guide us anymore in those situations, right? So it's very tricky feeling out what is the right move. And when you get into an abstract argument like the arming the future argument, it's leaving out all those contextual details, right? So it's not really a good guide to moral behavior because it's doing away with the rules, right? By putting us in an emergency situation, but then we don't have all the context and the details to really know how to navigate our way through that situation. The second problem, denial, right? So what they sort of ignore is the possibility that you could just stick with the rules, right? Um, Kant does this, right? And it's sort of surprising to our intuitions to say that, no, you should not lie to the soldier. You should never lie, right? This is some sort of basic categorical imperative. And people do find it unappealing, but it's worth considering, right? I mean, Kant is famous for a reason. He makes a very convincing argument for this sort of approach to morality and to ethics. Um, so you can kind of like to sort of support that idea, you can sort of formulate examples that pump different intuitions, right? So like, yes, some lesser evil arguments is going to feel obvious that you should do one over the other, but like, um, I don't know, would you kill your own grandmother in cold blood to prevent some greater evil, right? Some thing that would kill thousands of people? Maybe not, right? Maybe in that situation, maybe your intuitions are different. You're like, I can't kill my grandmother over anything. I'm sorry for all those people, but it's just like, violate some core humanity in me or something, right? So again, it's like that. His point is the lesser evil arguments. They sort of they tap into certain intuitions that yeah, sometimes you got to break the rules, but you have to be very careful that they're not leading you down the wrong path. And maybe it is the case that we should follow the rules, right, in this situation. Okay, and then towards the end of the argument, he gets into something interesting, but it's a little confusing. I'm going to try to help you with it a bit. So he talks about the unthinkable, right? And then he talks about Sophie's choice and stuff like that. So the idea is that sometimes it can be immoral even to consider certain options, right? So the idea being it might even be immoral to consider geoengineering, uh, especially when it's your fault that you're in that situation where you have to choose between those, right? So since we're the ones creating the climate crisis, it can be immoral to consider certain sort of lazy options, right? So consider like a sort of a parallel argument. Right? He says if no progress happens on climate change soon, there's probably eventually going to be some sort of apocalyptic scenario. People are going to be fighting for food. Um, so in that case, I better prepare for that by pulling my kids out of school, building a bunker right in the woods somewhere, and training them all in hand-to-hand combat, right, for some sort of Mad Max scenario. Um, if somebody told you that that's their plan, you might think that that's wrong, right? In some way, they've evaded their primary moral responsibility, right? We should address the problem of climate change, not prepare for a brutal war of all against all, right? So, in a sense, even considering or pursuing that option sort of reveals a sort of moral depravity. So sort of another example of this is the I don't know if you've seen there's a book or a film, Sophie's Choice. She talks about this concept of marring evil. So in Sophie's Choice, the main character, she's in Nazi Germany and she's faced with this choice. And yeah, we use Nazis all the time in ethics because it's such a clear example of evil, right? It's very very useful. Um, so she's faced with this choice. The soldiers come to her house and they say, "You have to give up one of your children to us, and if you don't, and you have to pick which one. And if you don't pick, then we take both." Okay, so the right thing to do is to pick which child is going to die. Um, Otherwise, they take both, right? But man, what a choice to have to make, right? Um, so she does it, right? And I guess it's the right thing. But in the end, she just can't live with having made that choice, and she takes her own life ultimately. This is the idea of a marring evil, right? There are sort of evils that can befall you that even if they're not sort of any fault of your own, and maybe you are not sort of morally culpable, nonetheless, they just make your life not worth living. Um, Now, you might argue that there is no such thing and that she should not have killed herself, or, right? But if you sort of concede that there are evils of that sort that can sort of damage you in such a way that your life becomes not worth living, um, this might be an example of that, right? And you might even say inflicting a marring evil on someone else is also a marring evil. So if you're one of those Nazi soldiers that made her make that choice, you might question your own self and whether you can live with yourself. So the question is, are these two choices of the arming the future argument a kind of a Sophie's choice, right? Are we imposing a sort of Sophie's choice on future generations, right? Certainly in a very specific, concrete context, climate change is going to sort of put pressure on people, right? With limited food and money, having to relocate, people are going to suffer, right? They're going to have to make choices between food and medicine and which child gets it and things like that. But I think more to the point, right, is that if we pursue this sort of arming the future strategy, we are imposing a sort of Sophie's choice on the future, right, to choose between these two evils. And again, if that's a marring evil, and if inflicting a marring evil on someone is a marring evil, then we may be inflicting a marring evil on ourselves, right? I hope that makes sense. It's just the idea is considering this argument like seriously is just reveals our own moral corruption, right? We have chosen not to do the obvious right thing, reduce emissions now, and instead we are contemplating imposing this choice between two evils on the next generation. So he really thinks that this arming the future argument, although it may initially sound convincing, really we should be ashamed of considering it, right? And it may lead us to even question our own moral worth as human beings, right? We're even thinking of letting our own evil behavior slide and inflicting this on future generations. Okay, so that's a pretty sort of like stark conclusion, right? It is a stark situation. In the next article, we'll uh, talking about the Oxford principles, which are some principles that a group, right, of ethicists have put together that should guide us towards, if we are going to consider geoengineering, how it could be done ethically.